The icy wind howls through the rigging. Salt spray stings sailors' eyes as they clutch trembling shoulders on a swaying ship. Darkness presses in, broken only by flickering lanterns, battling the shadows of storms and endless ocean. These men, driven by dreams of new worlds, endured unimaginable hardships, fighting exhaustion, hunger, and their own despair. To stay awake, they endured brutal methods, deafening drums to drown their thoughts, sharp lashings, and even forcing themselves into physically painful routines. Every second was a gamble, a test of human endurance against the relentless sea. Their courage, often unseen, kept these vessels afloat on treacherous waters. Step into their shoes and feel the human spirit's resilience in the face of nature's fury. If you're passionate about maritime history, hit subscribe to reach 3,000 followers. Tell us where you're watching from and let us know you're tuned in with a quick "I'm connected." You can imagine how it feels when the cold wind slices through your clothes, the salty spray stings your skin, and the creaking wood beneath your feet seems to groan with every roll of the ship. The air is thick with the smell of damp oak, tar, and sweat. Ice darted constantly to the horizon, searching for land or the next obstacle. Now today, we're diving into the gritty reality of life aboard the ships during the age of exploration, those perilous centuries when sailors pushed the limits of human endurance to expand empires across the globe. Back then, ships like caravels, galleons, and naos weren't just vessels. They were floating worlds. Built from 2,000 trees, their frames were stitched together with iron nails and lashings of hemp rope. The craftsmanship was rough but ingenious, combining local woods like oak, teak, and cedar to withstand the relentless battering of sea storms. These ships were lifelines, but they also harbored immense dangers, leaks, fires, and the constant threat of sinking. Navigation methods of the time were rudimentary by today's standards. Mariners relied on the stars, the sun, and simple instruments like the astrolabe and compass, sometimes made from lodestone, to find their way. Imagine trying to steer through storms, blind to the depth or the exact position, while keeping spirits alive in a cramped, swaying metal or wooden box. The crew's hierarchy was strict: the captain, the master, the quartermasters, and the common sailors. Every man knew his place, but survival depended on collective effort. Life at sea was brutal. Imagine long, months-long voyages that could stretch over 3,000 miles. Food was scarce and often spoiled. Think hard biscuits called ship's biscuit, dried salted meat, and rough grains. Fresh water was a precious commodity, often contaminated, leading to diseases like scurvy, which wiped out around 20% of crews. The salty air dried out skin and throats, and the constant motion made sleep elusive. Dreams were haunted by storms, shipwrecks, or the quiet despair of isolation. To stay awake, sailors had to find methods, some harsh, some inventive. The cruelest: physical punishment. Many crews resorted to lashings or beatings for those falling asleep during watch. Others used loud noises, banging bells, clanging chains, or even banging on the hull to jar sleepy eyes open. Think about the cold, sharp clang of metal on metal echoing through the damp halls, jolting tired sailors from their exhaustion. Another brutal method involved sensory overload. Some captains would throw buckets of cold water on sleeping sailors or splash them with salt water, an instant, jarring wake-up call. The chilling splash, combined with the icy gusts from vents or open hatches, could make you shiver uncontrollably, forcing you into alertness. It's hard to imagine how anyone endured these extremes without breaking, yet they did, driven by necessity. Then there were the psychological tricks. A common one was the use of alarms, blaring horns or shouting, to rouse the crew. These sounds pierced through the ship's timbers, blending with the howling wind outside. The goal was to keep everyone vigilant because a moment of sleep could mean disaster. Colliding with icebergs, running aground, or being caught in a storm that could tear the ship apart. Many sailors also resorted to physical exhaustion. They worked tirelessly at tasks like reefing sails, repairing hulls, or manning the cannons during stormy nights. The idea, fatigue would keep them from falling asleep unwittingly, but that only added to their suffering. Aching muscles, chafed hands, and the gnawing hunger, all compounded by the relentless cold or heat, depending on location. The psychological toll was harsh, too. Imagine being hundreds of miles from land, your family, your home, stranded in a metal prison tossed by the waves. The monotony, the constant danger, and the fear of death by storm or disease gnawed at their minds. Yet these methods, though brutal, were deemed necessary. They kept the ship's vital human machinery moving, often under extreme stress and with minimal relief. What's fascinating, though, is that amidst these horrors, stories of resilience emerged. Men formed close bonds, shared bread and stories, and found small ways to humanize their ordeal. Some sailors would tell jokes or sing songs during long watches, momentarily escaping their suffering. It's in these moments that the true human spirit shined brightest, surviving not just the sea, but the darkness within. So in this era of daring exploration, the methods to keep sailors awake ranged from the cruel to the clever. Each was a response to life and death necessity. Remember, every wave they braved, every storm they faced, was a testament to their endurance, both physical and mental. These sailors, with their blood, sweat, and tears, laid the groundwork for a world forever changed by the ships they built, manned, and pushed through the storm. Can you imagine how it feels to be locked in a prison that's constantly moving, where the air is thick with sweat, salt, and the sharp tang of rotting wood? The cold, biting wind cuts through your clothes like a blade, and the deck beneath your feet is a patchwork of splinters and rough planks. The thunder of the waves crashes against the hull, shaking the entire ship as you clutch onto rusted ropes and hope they don't snap. Today, we're going to step back into the age of exploration, but not just to hear about the ships or the discoveries. No. We're diving into what it was really like for those sailors, the human stories of survival, torment, and relentless discipline. And if you like stories that bring history to life, if you want to feel the salty spray on your face and the fear in your gut, then hit that like button right now. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate that notification bell, because what you're about to hear is a voyage you won't forget. Let's set the scene. It's the 15th to 18th century, the golden age of maritime exploration. Ships like the carracks, galleons, and later the frigates, stretching over 200 feet long, built to carry hope and death in equal measure. These vessels were floating prisons, crewed by hundreds of men packed tight, like sardines in a tin. Life on board was brutal, and death was always lurking. Mortality rates could hit 20%, sometimes even more, especially during long voyages across uncharted seas. Now picture yourself on a ship with a wooden frame that creaks and groans with every surge of the ocean. The smell hits you first, a thick mixture of salt, mold, and the stench of unwashed bodies. You can feel the grit of dried blood on your gums, maybe from a rope burn or a rogue splinter, and the taste of salt that's almost always on your tongue. The wind howls like a banshee, and the cold cuts through your clothes, numbing your fingers and toes. Your skin is raw from exposure, and the dampness seeps into your bones. It's a cruel, unrelenting environment. Today, we're going to reveal some of the cruelest yet most effective methods sailors endured to stay awake. Methods so harsh that they make modern sleep deprivation look like a luxury. But before we get into that, let's talk about why sailors did what they did. These voyages weren't just about adventure, they were about conquest, wealth, and survival. The ships carried precious cargo, sometimes gold, spices, or silk, and the crew knew that one mistake could mean death, or worse, mutiny or madness. Imagine you are part of a crew, and your captain demands constant vigilance. Why? Because hidden dangers lurked everywhere. Hidden reefs, enemy ships, storms that could turn a proud vessel into splintered wreckage in seconds. The sailors' lives depended on their alertness. But how do you keep a crew awake for days on end, especially when fatigue pulls at their eyelids like a heavy anchor? The answer was brutal methods designed to shock the body and mind into wakefulness. One of the most infamous was the use of physical punishment. A sailor caught falling asleep on watch might be whipped or beaten, not just as punishment, but as a visceral reminder: surrender to sleep and you risk your life and theirs. But cruelty wasn't limited to the lash. Sometimes sailors were subjected to more bizarre tactics. Imagine a crew member being forced to stand in freezing water, the cold soaked into his bones, his teeth chattering uncontrollably, blood vessels constricted in a desperate attempt to preserve warmth. Others were subjected to loud banging on the hull, drums, or even loud shouts that echoed through the night to jar them awake. The noise, the cold, the physical pain, all designed to shock the senses into wakefulness. But it wasn't just pain that kept men alert. Some captains devised psychological tricks. They would tie a sailor's eyelids open with strips of cloth or hang upside down from the mast for hours. Imagine the vertigo, the nausea, the blood rushing to your head, your muscles trembling from exhaustion, all to keep your eyes fixed on the horizon, alert for danger. And then there were methods so extreme they almost defy belief. Think about the water torture, where sailors would be dunked repeatedly, their heads submerged until they gasped for air, their lungs burning with salt water, or the use of foul, rotting rags soaked in vinegar and pressed against the face, forcing the sailor to breathe in a sharp, acrid smell that stung their eyes and made their stomachs turn. But it wasn't always about pain. Sometimes sailors were kept awake by bizarre and tragic means. Imagine a sailor chained to the mast, with a bucket of ice-cold seawater just inches away, as the crew below yelled and banged to keep him from slipping into sleep. The cold was an assassin, stealing warmth and life. And when all else failed, the crew relied on what they called wake-up drugs. These weren't like modern caffeine pills. No, sailors chewed on bitter roots, bitter herbs, or even used contraptions that delivered small jolts of electricity to the body. Crude but effective. This constant vigilance was part of the martyrdom of the sailor, a daily battle of mind and body. Many men suffered irreparable damage. Gums bled from constant biting, teeth shattered from clenching. They trembled uncontrollably, their vision blurred, their muscles aching with exhaustion. Some went mad, hallucinating monstrous sea creatures or ghostly sailors that whispered in the dark. And let's not forget the psychological toll, the isolation, the fear of falling asleep and dying in your sleep, the dread of being caught unalert, the shame and humiliation of punishment, and the sheer physical fatigue that turned into emotional despair. These men were fighting a war against their own bodies every single day. But it's important to realize that despite the brutality, these methods worked, at least temporarily. They kept men awake long enough to navigate treacherous waters and fend off enemies. Without them, ships would have been wrecked, crews overrun, or ships lost in storms. Now, if you want to know exactly how sailors managed to survive these hellish routines and what innovations they developed to combat sleep, there's a video right here on the channel. Because behind every brutal method, there was a desperate ingenuity born from survival. And that's the real story. Not just the ships or the explorers, but the human beings who endured unimaginable suffering for a chance at discovery, riches, and conquest. Their stories are a testament to resilience, even in the face of cruelty. So keep that in mind next time you rest easy in your warm bed, knowing how much effort and torment it took to get the world to where it is today. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a ship, the salty wind biting at your skin. The sun beats down mercilessly, and the deck beneath your feet creaks loudly with every wave. You're miles from land, trapped in a floating prison, fighting to stay awake. Welcome to the brutal reality sailors faced during the age of exploration, a time when survival often depended on cruel, ingenious tricks. You see, keeping a crew alert wasn't just about discipline, it was a matter of life and death. Now picture the sailors, their faces pale and sweaty, eyes glazed from exhaustion. They were battling a constant enemy, sleep. But the problem was tricky. Sleep was natural, unavoidable, and vital for health. Yet on ships where a single moment of inattention could mean disaster, they had to find ways to cheat their bodies of this necessity. And so, sailors came up with some pretty harsh solutions, methods that seem shocking today, but were seen as essential tools of survival back then. Let's dive into some of the most notorious, brutal techniques they used to stay awake. And trust me, each one was worse than the last, pushing human endurance to its limits. First up, the infamous shaking and jarring bedisahun method. Sailors would take turns slapping their faces, pinching their skin, or pounding their thighs with the palms of their hands. Imagine the sharp sting of cold seawater splashing across your face, your cheeks stinging from the slap, blood rushing to your head. The goal? Overwhelm the senses, jolt the mind awake. But it wasn't just physical. Some sailors tied small cords around their limbs, pulling on them gently or sharply to induce discomfort. The pain kept their minds from drifting into sleep, even as their bodies begged for rest. But this approach had its dangers. Overdoing it could lead to injuries, broken skin, or even fainting. And it was exhausting, physically and mentally. Many sailors, desperate for relief, would sometimes fall into a kind of exhausted stupor anyway, only to be awakened harshly by their crewmates. It was an endless cycle of torment. Next, the biting and chewing method. You might think it sounds primitive, but it was surprisingly common. Sailors chewed on bitter roots, herbs like mugwort, or even strips of leather. Some used devices, crude contraptions that delivered tiny electric shocks, shocking their bodies awake when they started to nod off. Yes, electric shocks on a wooden ship. It sounds crazy, but it worked. The shock was enough to startle the nerves, jolting the sailor awake. That's how resourceful they got, turning the ship's limited equipment into survival tools. And still, it wasn't enough. Many sailors suffered broken teeth from clenching their jaws tight or bleeding gums from biting too hard. Some people hallucinated, seeing monstrous sea creatures or ghostly figures whispering in the dark. The mental toll was just as brutal as the physical. Remember, being hundreds of miles from land, cut off from loved ones, under constant threat of storms or enemy ships, that's enough to drive anyone mad. But no, the hardships weren't over. Cruelly, sailors also used forced movement. They'd make them walk around the deck in circles, jump, or do quick sprints. The idea, keep the blood flowing, keep the body active. Yet on a cramped ship, space was tight, sometimes only a few feet between mast and rail. Imagine trying to dodge swinging cargo, low beams, and fellow crew members, all while your legs trembled from exhaustion. The cold, salty air stung your lungs as you huffed and puffed, trying to stay alert. It was a constant fight against physical fatigue, and often it just made things worse. But the worst, the noose and restraint methods, some captains resorted to tying sailors, forcing them to stand upright for hours. The pain was immense, muscles cramping, circulation cut off. Sometimes sailors would be strapped to the mast, their arms tied, eyelids heavy, fighting the urge to sleep. The crew was human after all. Many would faint, slump down, only to be jolted awake again with a stick or splash of water. The cruelty was clear, torture disguised as a survival tactic. And it wasn't just about method. The ship's design played a role. Many vessels had little space for rest. The crew slept in hammocks, which could be moved aside easily. But if you were to be kept awake, you'd be forced to sit or stand for hours, muscles stiffening as the cold seeped into your bones. Imagine the groans and curses of sailors, their muscles trembling from fatigue, their vision blurring as sleep beckoned. Now you might wonder, what about food and drink? Well, dehydration was another enemy. Sailors often sipped seawater, salty and unpalatable, trying to stave off thirst, but it only made dehydration worse. Dehydration led to headaches, dizziness and hallucinations. Plus, the constant exposure to the sun and wind dried out their skin, making their lips crack and their eyes red. The environment itself was a brutal opponent, not just the enemies beyond the horizon, but the ship's own conditions. And what about the mental state of these sailors? Imagine the psychological strain, the fear of falling asleep and being thrown overboard, the shame of dozing off in front of your mates, the dread of storms or pirates looming nearby. Sleep deprivation wasn't just fatigue, it was a form of torture that wore down their minds. Some sailors suffered hallucinations, paranoia, or bouts of despair that made their survival even harder. But behind all this brutality, there was a spark of human ingenuity. Sailors weren't just victims, they were survivors. They developed these methods out of necessity. Today, we have sleep stations, caffeine pills, energy drinks. But back then, they improvised with what they had: roots, herbs, physical punishment, and mental tricks. And here's the startling part. Despite all the suffering, these methods saved lives. They kept men alert enough to steer the ship through storms, avoid deadly reefs, and fend off pirates. Without them, ships would be wrecked, crews overrun, or men falling into the deep, dark ocean in their sleep. Cruel, yes, but effective, at least temporarily. Now imagine the stories of sailors like John, who described feeling blood trickle down his chin from biting too hard, or Marcus, who was strapped to the mast for hours, trembling with exhaustion. Their stories weren't just about ships and exploration, they were about resilience, the human spirit burning bright amid torment. So if you think about it, the ships of the colonial era weren't just vessels of wood and sail. They were prisons, battlegrounds, and schools of survival. Each method of keeping sailors awake was a testament to human ingenuity pushed to its limits. These men endured torment that few of us can fathom today. And when you rest comfortably in your bed tonight, remember what it took to get humanity across uncharted waters. The suffering, the cruelty, but also the extraordinary resourcefulness. Because behind every discovery, every conquest, there's a story of human endurance, stories that remind us how much we've grown and how far we've come. If you want to learn exactly how sailors managed to push through these hellish routines, how they improvised and fought their bodies, and how some even succeeded, you'll find that story right here on the channel. Because the real voyage isn't just about maps and treasures. It's about the people, those brave, battered souls who faced the storms on deck and in their minds, fighting to stay alive for a shot at discovery. Imagine you're standing on the deck of a ship hundreds of miles from land. The wind screams in your ears. The salty spray stings your face. The sun beats down, relentless and scorching. And all around you, the vast, dark ocean stretches to the horizon, silent but deadly. Now try to picture what it took to keep the crew awake, alert enough to navigate this nightmare. Because back then, sailors didn't have coffee or energy drinks. They had to improvise. And some methods were downright brutal. Let's get real. Keeping men awake for weeks on end was a nightmare of its own. A cruel, yet surprisingly effective part of colonial maritime life. Imagine the relentless boredom mixed with the stress of impending disaster, the need to stay vigilant at all costs. If a sailor nodded off, even for a second, it could mean disaster. So they used methods that seem barbaric today, but were born out of pure necessity. One of the most infamous was the use of physical punishment. We're talking about lashings, beatings, and even brutal shoves. The idea was simple. Pain kept men awake. Cruel. Absolutely. But in the chaos of storms and reefs, some captains believed it was the only way to prevent the nightmare of a sinking ship or a mutiny. Imagine a sailor, exhausted beyond reason, trembling under the lash, blood dribbling down his back, every strike fueling a desperate fight to stay conscious. It was mental torture as much as physical, pushing the body to its limits. And when pain wasn't enough, sailors resorted to more inventive tricks. Think about the mental games, shouting loud noises or even firing muskets to startle the crew awake. Some captains kept rattles or drums rolling through the night, creating a constant deafening noise that drilled into your skull. If you managed to nod off, a sudden explosion or a loud shout might jolt you back to reality, sometimes with a cry of surprise, sometimes with a gasp for air. But perhaps the most harrowing technique was forcing men into uncomfortable positions. Imagine being strapped to the mast for hours, shivering in the cold, salt spray stinging your skin. That was no picnic. The idea was that discomfort would keep your mind focused, your body trembling with fatigue, desperately trying to avoid falling asleep. Some sailors were forced to bite down on leather bits, their teeth clenched so tightly their gums bled, their mouths full of bitter leather, trying to avoid slipping into unconsciousness. Others would be kept standing, knees buckling under the weight of exhaustion, their chins trembling as they fought to stay upright. Now don't forget, this wasn't just about the physical. The psychological toll was brutal. Imagine the mental strain of being strapped down, your muscles aching, your mind fraying at the edges. Some sailors reported hallucinations after days without sleep, phantoms dancing on the horizon, whispers in the wind, or shadows moving in the depths. It was a form of torture that could break a man faster than a storm at sea. Yet many endured because they believed their lives and the ship's mission depended on it. And then came the tricks of the mind, mental tricks to stave off exhaustion. Some sailors would sing, recite prayers, or count the seconds in their head. Others would chew on roots or herbs, hoping the bitter taste would keep alertness alive. Some captains went as far as to whip themselves into a frenzy, forcing their bodies into hyper-awareness, desperately fighting the fog creeping into their brains. But the truth is, these methods were not foolproof. They saved lives, yes, but they also left scars. Physical scars, emotional scars, and stories that would be passed down through generations. Stories of men pushed to the edge of madness and beyond. Think about John, who once told how blood trickled down his chin from biting so hard during a sleepless night. Or Marcus, strapped to the mast, trembling with exhaustion, tears streaming down his face, praying for it all to end. Now here's the twist. Despite all this suffering, some sailors actually survived and even thrived. Their bodies and minds hardened in ways we can barely imagine. They developed resilience, a kind of mental toughness that carried them through hell and back. Many of these men came out of their voyages changed forever, some physically maimed, others emotionally scarred. Yet they carried stories of courage that still echo today. Think about how these experiences contrast sharply with our modern lives. Today, we press a button and a machine ensures we stay awake. Coffee, energy drinks, alarm clocks. A far cry from lashings, shouts, and torture devices. We can forget what it meant to fight our own bodies, just to survive a storm or keep watch during a moonless night. Now, as you reflect on all this, take a moment to appreciate the ease we have now. It's easy to take comfort for granted, but behind every technological convenience, there's a story of sacrifice, stories of human endurance, of men who face death at every turn, not with ease, but with grit. Their sacrifices built the foundations of the world we live in today. And that's the real legacy of these sailors, hidden stories of unimaginable suffering, resilience, and courage. Their struggles remind us how far humanity has come. They fought not just the ocean, but their own bodies, their own minds. Their sacrifices paved the way for the advances we now enjoy: safety, comfort, and the knowledge that we're protected from the worst of nature's fury. So next time you're feeling tired or overwhelmed, think about these brave souls. Imagine what it was like to stare into the abyss, to fight your own exhaustion with every ounce of strength you had. Because their courage isn't just history, it's a lesson. One about human resilience, about pushing past pain, and about never giving up in the face of the impossible. And if you want to dive deeper into how sailors managed to push through these hellish routines, how they fought their own bodies and minds, and how some even succeeded, you know where to look. Just hit that like button, subscribe for more stories, and stay tuned for the next voyage into maritime history. Because the real adventure isn't just about ships and treasures, it's about the brave souls who dared to face the storms, both outside and within.